Joining us this morning is Malik Imtiaz Sarwar, lawyer, activist and political candidate for the Malaysian Civil Liberties Movement, or MCML. Among others, he had represented the Selangor state government in the Teoh Beng Hock inquest, and he also held a watching brief on Lina Joy's conversion case, and also secured the release of Raja Petra Kamaruddin from ISA. As usual, please send your questions and comments to 016-201-9000 or tweet us at BFM Radio. Phone lines will open after 8:15. Welcome and thank you for spending time with us today. Now, the coroner of the Teoh Beng Hock's inquest had ruled out that it was not suicide nor homicide that caused Teoh's death. Was it a conclusion that you had expected, or it exceeded your expectations?
Well, I think it was a politically safe verdict. It gave a little bit to both sides. There was no suicide findings, so the family couldn't necessarily be unhappy about that. But at the same time, wasn't a homicide finding, so there could be no reaction from other forces. I think the verdict was unsatisfactory. When I say that with the greatest respect to the coroner, obviously he did what he thought was the right thing to do, and I have no complaint about that. But I think the reasoning of the coroner doesn't quite sit with the evidence that we had. And to say that it was neither one or the other, what exactly does that mean? I mean, the first set of pathologists ruled out the possibility of it being an accident. So it was either a suicide or a homicide. And if once he ruled out suicide, there being no evidence of suicide, then following the logic of the situation, it would have been, I think, reasonable to conclude that Teoh had been, there was a homicide involved. I think the verdict rests on a concern on the part of the coroner, who, while agreeing that there was actually a pre-fall injury, which was very, very contested and highly disputed, but finally we managed to establish that through Dr. Ponte. There was a pre-fall injury to the neck that happened while he was in custody, during that period of time, I should correct myself. The coroner said, yeah, while that did happen, he didn't have enough material before him to link that to the eventual death of Teoh Beng Hock, and that's why he said he couldn't see that as being necessarily definitive of a homicide. Well, I think on the surface that seems right. There was some evidence that the coroner didn't consider closely, including evidence that suggested that he fell unconscious when he was in an unconscious state. And this was not just a matter of surmise necessarily, because there were serious injuries, but there were no injury patterns that reflected a fall on the part of a person who was conscious. For example, it's quite normal for a person to have wrist fractures when one falls from height, because the instinct is self-preservation, so you would actually reach out to try and correct yourself. And that would eventually lead to wrist fractures. There were no wrist fractures here. The surmise was that he landed on his feet firmly, and that led to the conclusion on the part of the first set of pathologists that he was conscious. But it was also shown to the coroner that when one lands on the feet that way, there's usually a transferred force up the spine, which results in a ring fracture at the base of the skull. And we pointed out that there was no such fracture there as well. And there were other things as well. For example, the fact that there was an edema of the brain, and two pathologists actually said that suggested hypoxia, which could in turn lead to unconsciousness. So there's quite a bit there that we felt was not adequately addressed. And we feel that if it was looked at more closely, it may well have resulted in finding of homicide. But of course I say this with respect to the coroner's decision, and I of course have to say that there is a revision application being mounted by the AG, or at least that's what the papers say, and I'm not entirely clear why the AG is unhappy with the decision, because ultimately, looking at the submissions of counsel for the AG during the verdict, they essentially argued the middle approach, which is that it was not clear one way or the other. So I'm not entirely sure what he's unhappy about. The family has said they are applying for revision, and a revision in this case is a review by the High Court of the evidence and the findings of the coroner to see whether he had made any mistakes, and there have been instances in the past where the High Court actually does say the coroner came to a wrong conclusion. The family has said they wish to pursue that, and I don't think they filed it yet, but that they're going to do it quite soon. As far as the Selangor government is concerned, I'm waiting for instructions.
Well, one option is it for the Teoh family to file a civil suit against the MACC? Could the Teoh family sue MACC?
Yes, they can. They can sue for wrongful death or associated causes of action. I think, from what I understand, the lawyers are actually looking at possible suit already.
But would you see this as possibly a fruitless exercise that would really depend on who will be the judge presiding over the case?
Well, I think the presumption is that all judges will hear it fairly. When you say fruitless, I'm not sure how to respond to that directly, because the filing of the suit is not necessarily just about getting damages. It's also a process of vindication as such. And many people have said to us that this inquest was a waste of time because what did it result in at the end of the day? Well, my response to that is, well, we've had an airing of evidence. We've had an insight into how the MACC operates. We've established that there was actually pre-fall injury. And these are things that the family need to see and hear in order to be able to reconcile with what's happened to them. So there's some sort of reconciliation we have to look at. The filing of a suit may help them get there, although the result is uncertain. A lot will depend on what the evidence is and so on and so forth. So I think there is value in doing it, if only to allow the family to reach some point of equilibrium on it, as well as to allow Malaysians to see what exactly is happening in these sorts of areas.
Yes, and I suppose the public will actually form their own conclusion, isn't it?
Yes.
And the Malaysian Anti-Corruption, MACC, the prosecutor had asked Dr. Pontip during the inquest if she had any experience jumping off a building. I remember that. I think that invited a bit of a laughter there. And I recall you stood up and said, well, with questions like these, we will all want to jump off a building. So, but on a more serious note, what do you think are some gaps in the MACC?
Gaps in what sense?
Gaps are maybe in the way they investigate cases, in the way they present cases, in the way they question witnesses.
Well, I'm no expert on the MACC, but I can say from what we saw in the Teoh Beng Hock scenario, there seems to be an almost single-minded pursuit of a particular objective. Sometimes, I mean, in Teoh Beng Hock, we heard of how his being taken in was part of a wider operasi on the part of the MACC to look into all the Pakatan Rakyat aduns. Why Pakatan Rakyat aduns, I'm not entirely sure, but it seems too selective for. I mean, one would think they would look at corruption across the board, and there's enough all around. So that in itself was questionable to me. And then, of course, the fact that they've maintained that he was a witness, but insisted that he stay there from 6:30 to, well, according to them, 3:30 in the morning. This, to me as well, I don't quite understand why that was necessary. I think that's something that shouldn't happen. There was also evidence to show that they didn't allow counsel to be present during the interview, and I don't think that's right. I think this case reinforces the need for there to be some sort of independent person in attendance to ensure that whatever the case, there's no misperception one way or the other. Also, I think in terms of the quality of the people who work for the MACC, at least from what we saw in the Teoh Beng Hock inquest, I think attention has to be paid there, because there were people there who had qualified after SPM and who are now investigative officers with the MACC. This is not to run them down, but ultimately, when you're dealing with white-collar sort of scenarios, how experienced, how proficient are these people in understanding what's going on, and is that a reason that they may actually ultimately feel it necessary to maybe use tactics that are not easily reconciled with basic guarantees, especially when you have this all or nothing sort of approach to governance. I can just imagine a junior MACC officer being told, get this, and then being told, do what you have to do to get it, and then not knowing how to get it, resorting to maybe tactics that may not be the best thing to do. These are realities. So I figured that MACC needs to really look at the kind of people who are working for it, especially since they're dealing with such complex financial matters, and that is probably one of the weakest links I've seen so far. There's also this question of whether the AG should be given discretion over MACC prosecutions. The Constitution does say that only the AG is entitled to institute prosecutions, and that's why, even though the MACC is supposed to be an independent commission, the decision to institute a case is still the AG's. And there's been some grumbling about that. And that's something that I think we have to look at. But personally, I think we also should look at whether the AG himself should be given the power of prosecution, or whether we should take that away from him and give it into some independent commission or services like the way they have in the UK, the Crown Prosecution Services. Because the AG ultimately is a political position. And in cases like this especially, perceptions are extremely important. Justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. And my position has always been that when you appoint the AG, the IGP, the MACC commissioner by way of contract, you immediately put them into positions of conflict of interest. They have to protect themselves and their security and their future, sometimes at the expense of the case or the job they're doing. And this is no reflection on them personally. I think it's a natural human instinct to do. So I think that's the other thing that should be looked at as well in all of this.
What can be done to strengthen the independence of the AG?
Well, as I said, I think the independence of the AG can be strengthened by firstly taking away the power of prosecution, although I think that's going to be met with some resistance. But the other way is to maybe give him the security of tenure that the Auditor General has. And that's interesting because the Auditor General can only be removed by Parliament, a tribunal as such, but through
Parliament. But the AG can't.
No, AG is in many ways just a glorified civil servant. He holds office at the pleasure of His Majesty in that way, in the way that other civil servants do. Although ultimately it's by contract and not by civil service appointment. And this is something that civil society has always been a bit concerned about. And the same goes for the IGP. We hear of contracts being extended and so on in the media. And ultimately, the impression I have, and I stand to be corrected on this, is that these individuals are appointed by the government by contract and therefore can be, in one way or the other, removed as well by the government. And when you have that hanging over your head and you don't have security of tenure, then obviously, it's a natural human instinct to think about saving your job and so on. And I think that's something that we should be looking at. If I remember correctly, the first draft of the Constitution, and maybe even the first version of the Constitution, did actually provide for security, but it's not there as it stands. And I'm not sure whether that was because it was not put in, I have to check that, or whether it was removed at some point.
We are speaking with Malik Imtiaz Sarwar, lawyer and political candidate for the Malaysian Civil Liberties Movement, MCML. If you have any questions for him, please send them to 016-201-9000 or call us at 03-771-09000. After this, we'll talk about the Lina Joy case. On the breakfast grill this morning, Malik Imtiaz Sarwar, lawyer and political candidate for the Malaysian Civil Liberties Movement, or MCLM, is with us this morning. So if you have any questions for him, please send them to 016-201-9000 or ring us at 03-771-09000. Now, you held a watching brief over Lena Joy's case. She was born a Muslim and wanted to convert out of the religion into Christianity. Do our laws and the federal constitution allow for conversion out of Islam?
Now, that's the interesting thing. I don't think there's a single decision of this country's courts that have said that people like Lena Joy cannot convert out. In fact, if you look at the decision in Lena Joy as well as another decision of that apex court, the position taken is that yes, you can convert out, but you have to do it in accordance with the Sharia law through a Sharia court. And that's where the ambiguity starts. So I'd like to get that clear straight away. No court has ever said in this country that a Muslim is not permitted to convert out of his or her religion. The problem is, from my experience and from what I've seen, the applications in the Sharia court are either not dealt with because they are potentially very, very difficult, emotional, controversial sort of applications, or they are outright, or they are dismissed outright, or they are reasoned in ways which are quite, with the greatest respect, again, quite mind-boggling. A couple of instances come to mind. You have the situation of Revati in Malacca, who on advice went to the Sharia court to say that she was not a Muslim, to get a declaration, and this was because she had been raised by a Hindu grandmother. The upshot was she was kept in a rehabilitation center for 108 days after having made that application, and I'm not sure whether she ever got that resolved at all. She had a child taken away from her, and so on and so forth. So that is the public perception of how these things are dealt with. There's another instance of a woman in Penang, and everyone has said that. You see, the Sharia court actually does give these orders. The Sharia court, in allowing her to renounce Islam, said that she was never a Muslim to start with, because she had converted in for the purpose of marriage, and her former husband had not bothered to explain to her what the religion was about. I'm putting that a bit simplistically, but in essence that's what was said. So that's not an indication at all on the part of the Sharia court judges' approach to these things. I've read of one Sharia court judge actually saying the Constitution doesn't apply in his court, and I'm quite surprised because Sharia courts are in Malaysia and the Constitution applies across the board equally. So what we have here is a reluctance on the part of Muslim adjudicators within the Sharia court, as well as I think in the civil courts, to grapple with this issue. And over the years, what we've had is, with the greatest respect, again, a judicial hand-washing that has led to no resolution for people in that position. And who are the people in that position? I think the number of Muslims, born Muslims, who want to get out of the religion is minimal. I think the biggest sector there are those who have become Muslim either for the purpose of marriage or for whatever reason, and for their own reasons now wish to go back to their original faith or renounce Islam. And the most common example is because of a divorce or because of a death of a spouse. And try as we might to brush this aside and say that it's not a big issue for this country, it is a very big issue. And so that led us into considering how it is that we could look at this issue a bit on a wider plane. And I don't know if you remember this, but we set up a coalition of NGOs. When I say we, I meant Hakam. I'm president of the National Human Rights Society. Along with other NGOs, we set up something called Article 11, which was a coalition of NGOs. We started a roadshow. It became quite controversial. The Prime Minister, then Badawi, said that we should stop our activities. And what we were doing there was to try and show people, create an awareness that really the Constitution applied equally for all. And therefore, there was equal protection for all, regardless. And unfortunately, to the way things are right now, there seems to be a lack of political will to address this issue because it's potentially highly problematic. Every time something like this comes up, you see a group of individuals getting together, a group of organizations getting very extreme and getting very vocal about it. And I tend to think that within the Islamic community, there's an extremist minority that tends to drown out the silent majority in many ways. And they are shaping the way things are working at the moment. And that, of course, sits on a bed of race and religious politics. And that's, I think, at the root of all evil in this country, ultimately. So, I'm sorry, I've taken a roundabout way of answering your question. If you ask me, as a matter of law, there is no restriction of the right of Muslims to renounce faith.
Even in the Sharia law?
Yeah, well, according to Sharia law, there's a conservative view that you can't, and that can be restricted in the present life. But there is a different view, what some are calling the modernist view. And by modernist, I don't mean now, I mean from the 60s and the 50s, where they say, well, there's nothing in the sacred texts or the sources of law that actually point conclusively to the right of the state to restrict. And if at all, it's a personal matter between the individual believer and God. But I don't want to get into a theological argument here because there will be people who will say that I'm not qualified to speak about these things. But from my reading, this is the situation. So, I mean, I've put myself in the shoes of a Sharia judge. His mandate is to ensure that the Islamic law is applied. Now, if he's a Muslim, he's not about to sanction the renunciation of religion by another Muslim. And prior to 1999, there was no need for sanction. Many people have overlooked this, but up to 1999, you didn't need a declaration to change your religion. In fact, what you did was you took out a deed poll, you swore out your new name, that you had changed your religion, advertised it in a newspaper, and there it was done.
That's how Lena Joy actually managed to change her name to Lina, to a Christian name in 1999?
Yeah, well, that a little bit more nuanced in Lena Joy's case because she was dealing with the authorities there. But in the mid-90s, there was a sudden shift in the way the government looked at these things, and from my standpoint, it seems to have been a little bit more aggressive in Islamization. That was when Anwar Ibrahim was still in government, and I mean, we can't run away from the fact that he championed the Islamic cause. And it was during that time that these objections began to be taken, that if people were doing this, the religious departments would not recognize what they had done. So the issue here is not so much about renunciation of faith, it's about state recognition of choices of religion. And the problem is compounded because unlike other countries or many other countries, we are defined by religion in this country for state and public purposes. Muslims carry identity cards with the word Islam on it. So there is state-defined religion. Islam means what the state says it is, and that's a problem for some. And then on top of that, you are defined and characterized by reference to your religious status in public life. And that's also a problem. And because of that, it's become a chicken and egg. So when you tell the AG, for example, that, I don't think this should be done this way. I mean, some of us have spoken to him, and he's been very open to discussing it with us. Then he will say, well, if this doesn't happen this way, I mean, we don't identify you as a Muslim, how do we enforce the Islamic law then? But then the question would be, do you need to enforce Islamic law in the way you're doing it right now? Should it not be viewed from the perspective of freedom of religion as well? And if you're saying that we're going to enforce Islamic law, whose version of Islamic law are you enforcing? And ultimately, we're left in the hands of a group of individuals who might be qualified, but who will come up with fatwas banning yogas and so on and so forth, in the way they do things here. Compare ourselves to, say, Indonesia, where it's still a very large Islamic country, but they don't seem to be having the kind of difficulties we have in terms of unity and identification. Except for Aceh, Islamic law is not enforced in the way it's being enforced here. And I think if you look at the Constitution, things have gone very far and they've become very set in the way they are. But I think if you look at the Constitution, there were foundations for a very different type of more inclusive society, and the evidence of that lies in the way that we were up to the early 80s. And again, I come back to race and religious politics having changed all of this. The moment we emphasize race as being a prerequisite to certain benefits or privilege, that introduced the whole religious dynamic into politics, because under the constitution, a Malay is defined as being, amongst other things, a person professing the religion of Islam. So some judges have taken this very extreme view that because the constitution says a Malay is Muslim, he cannot change his faith. But that does not address the sociological dimension of it. Sure, for purpose of law, he might not be a Malay, therefore he can't qualify as a Bumiputra and for Malay privilege. But as a matter of his individual standing, he is still anthropologically and sociologically still a Malay, culturally and so on. So that part of it. And I think also the closure of public space has prevented us from discussing this freely. It's become political capital. So when someone stands up and says, I think this is wrong, then everyone shouts at him and calls him an apostate. Or minority group calls him an apostate, or says that he's worshipping the devil or whatever it is. And you see that in the way PAS and UMNO have been interacting over the years. They try to out-Islamize each other in many ways to attract the voter sentiment. And that's unfortunate, because ultimately the religion and our unity and harmony suffers. So again, sorry about that. The short answer is, strictly speaking, there are no restrictions in this country. The course is supposed to be the Sharia court. I don't think that's correct, but there is a federal court decision that says that I think the Sharia court has no jurisdiction over any person who does not profess the religion of Islam. You ask me, is Lina Joy a Muslim? Obviously not. She says she's a Christian. But is she in law or by the state a Muslim? Well, they're saying that she is until she gets the requisite exit orders.
Well, the federal court ruled that she remains a Muslim and her religion status will not be removed from her IC. But what facts did they consider before arriving at such a decision?
Well, basically it was almost a completely legal argument. The federal court, by majority, there was a very strong dissenting opinion by Justice Richard Melanjung, who's now the Chief Judge of Borneo, Sabah Sarawak. The majority view there was that Lina Joy would have to first get an order from the Sharia court declaring her an apostate before she could give effect to her religious choice. That's what they said. They never said she could not be a non-Muslim.
So they passed it on to the Sharia court?
Absolutely. So that's what I meant when I said judicial hand-washing. There seems to be a lot of passing the buck, because no one actually wants to deal with the situation conclusively. And that, to me, I think, is partly because there's it's a very emotional subject, and my experience has been that the lines have become so blurred between public sphere and our private lives that in some cases our decision makers are allowing their own personal morality to cloud the scenario and to color their judgments on these sorts of things. It's unfortunate. But that in turn points to a bigger problem we're facing, that there's general lack of confidence in the institutions of this country. Public perception is extremely important for a functioning democracy, but when we look around, let's leave aside what the government tells us, but when we look around on the ground, read what's on the internet and so on and so forth, there is a generally low morale when we talk about these things. There's a sentiment that the courts don't actually behave the way they should be. The courts aren't making the kind of decisions
Are they under political pressure, or are they under public pressure?
Well, I don't think it's a question of public pressure so much, because I can't say for sure that there's political pressure. Obviously, that's not something I can prove. But ultimately, there have been many reports about the lack of independence on the way the judges approached it. And although, to be fair, there have been attempts to change some of that mindset, and the recent appointments from the bar onto the bench are, I think, an indication that the judiciary is open to some change. But ultimately, it comes back to what the public thinks. There's no point saying we're independent if the public doesn't think you are. And if the public doesn't think you are, there must be a reason for that. Look at the fallout from the Perak decision. Generally, people felt that, I say this again with the greatest respect to the bench, generally people felt that the federal court's decision was a political one. And no matter what you tell them, you can't say they're stupid, you can't say they're ill-informed, because ultimately they are the constituents whose confidence we are supposed to be nurturing when it comes to maintaining public confidence in our institutions. There it is. So I don't think people feel that the judiciary is as independent as it should be. And that, again, boils down to a question of perception. And there are little things that have happened over the years, some big things, removal of Saleh Abbas in '88 and so on, and more recently little things like many questions were asked about how it is that the next UMNO legal advisor could become the Chief Justice, and would that not have a bearing on things? Sure, you could say that it did not. He could say, don't worry, I'm not going to sit on any UMNO cases, as he has said, the Chief Justice. But at the end of the day, when people look at the institution and they think there is this Chief Justice who's a link to UMNO, then even if he may not have had any direct link to anything, they will still believe it. So those are pitfalls that I think we can avoid quite easily by approaching these sorts of things objectively. But unfortunately, again, we live in a highly politicized environment, and everything, almost everything in the public sphere seems to be a political decision. And there doesn't seem to be a clear enough line between matters of governance and matters of politics. And you see that being blurred all the time. You know, when the Prime Minister takes a pot shot at the opposition by saying they don't know what they're talking about, and he does that as Prime Minister, what does that say? If he's doing it as UMNO President and Chair of the Barisan, that's different. But sometimes it's not easy to separate those two, and it might be better for the Prime Minister not to be saying those sorts of things, because ultimately he is the Prime Minister of all of us, regardless of our political affiliations or allegiances.
We are speaking with Malik Imtiaz Sarwar, lawyer and political candidate for the Malaysian Civil Liberties Movement, MCLM. If you have any questions for him, please send them to 016-201-9000 or call us at 03-7710-9000. After the news, we'll talk about your involvement in politics. This morning, we have Malik Imtiaz Sarwar, a human rights lawyer, activist, and political candidate for the Malaysian Civil Liberties Movement. If you have any questions for him, please send them to 016-201-9000 or call us at 03-7710-9000. Now, we were talking about the Lena Joys case and also about, to some extent, Islamization seems to be taking place and how courts seem reluctant to, hand down a fair judgment to speak of.
I say definitive, not fair.
Definitive,
they all think they're being fair.
Judgment.
Yeah, definitive judgment.
Okay, but let's talk a bit more about this Islamization before we get into, you wanting to get into politics. Now, Anwar Ibrahim, let's say if Anwar Ibrahim's led Pakatan Rakyat, and which also includes PAS, and they take over the government, do you think, this Islamization trend will reverse?
I'd like to think so. I can't say for sure. To be very objective about it, I can't say for sure because we've not heard firm commitments on key issues pertaining to this aspect of governance from Anwar. We've heard things said in different venues and different forums, but speaking to different audiences, the message is slightly different at times. We still have the highly publicized Islamic State agenda on the part of the PAS. Although I'm not entirely sure whether that's a fair reflection of how serious the issue is for them, because from those that I've spoken to and my impression of their manifesto, they're more concerned with a welfare state, a social welfare state, and getting to the root of problems rather than using the Islamic State agenda as a political campaign as such. Having said that, there are things being said, which I can't deny. So I will say honestly that I'm still a little bit confused about what it is that's going to be done about this issue if they take government or if they form government. But I think, having said that, the coalition seems to be more inclusive than what I've observed the BN to be. You can't run away from the dynamic within the BN and the relevance of MC and MIC to the bigger picture there. But there seems to be greater cooperation on within the Pakatan between the DAP, PAS and Keadilan, although I'm sure I'm going to get slammed for saying this. So I think that the multiracial component seems to be a bigger feature of the Pakatan discourse than it is of the Barisan, notwithstanding One Malaysia and everything. So that might have a bearing. It must have a bearing. I'll correct myself. I think it must have a bearing because ultimately we are to live together in this country as one united nation. We will have to address anything that divides us, and race and religion is extremely divisive and must be, in one way or the other, contained. One of the things that people keep on talking about is Article 153 of the Constitution, and depending on who you're speaking to, everyone has a view. Well, I think generally you have the extremist or the ultra-Malay view, which is that 153 gives them a privileged existence, and it's not just a question of affirmative action. And one view is that, well, it is affirmative action, but it's guaranteed by the Constitution, so there's no question of taking it away. One view seems to be, well, yes, it is, and maybe it's time to look at whether we should be reviewing that, leave the constitutional provision there, but at least relook at the policy because it's not a mandatory condition. And we've heard people like Nazir Razak say things to that effect. And of course, on the other side, you have, no, we can't have 153 at all. And personally, I think that's looking at it wrongly, because if you look at 153, it actually provides for protection of all the constituents and all the key players. So you have natives of Sabah and Sarawak and Malays. That's the first component. They can be protected through affirmative action measures. And at the same time, the legitimate interests of other communities are not to be ignored. So if you apply that equally across the board, you could develop an extremely useful and inclusive policy to eradicate poverty, and at the same time include those who have been marginalized into society. And I think I can say safely at this stage that this is one of the things we're actually looking at with the MCLM, and it will be one of the things we'll be speaking about fairly soon. We're looking at measures, and we're going to propose ideas on how this issue can be resolved in a way that will appease all stakeholders. I know that sounds like a political answer, but it's not. I really do believe that there's a way in which we can do this without stepping on anybody's toes and without giving anybody the opportunity to create mileage out of it, although I'm sure that will happen, right? So yeah, I think ultimately we will, by circumstance or otherwise, if the Pakatan takes government, it will have to address that. But I think having said that, I think the Barisan is also showing that it's prepared, it's more prepared to address the issue than it was before. And this is the problem with what I perceive to be the situation as we stand, because politics tend to trump everything. So while government, meaning cabinet and the Prime Minister, may have some good ideas, ultimately we know for a fact that those ideas are only capable of being executed to the extent that the political will behind the Prime Minister allows for it. And when that happens, you have the Prime Minister looking over his shoulder, and other politicians as well looking over their shoulder, to see whether or not they will maintain the support they have to allow them to be where they are. And ultimately, political survival becomes the key thing. And this is why some of us in civil society have been saying for some time that these party structures should be arranged in such a way that the leader of the party is one thing, and the politician that ultimately becomes the Prime Minister or whoever, the minister, is a different thing. So the party affairs don't necessarily impact on the governance of the country. There should be a clearer line. I understand that you can't completely separate the two, but I think it can be done, and you see examples of that in the US model, for example. So I think by circumstance, this will have to be addressed at some point. Younger Malaysians, regardless of what their racial backgrounds are now talking about things in a very different way. And we can't overlook the fact that we do have some dinosaurs in the cabinet who are very used to things the way they were 20 years ago. And as younger politicians come in, on both sides of the divide, there will be a newer perspective on things. And in as much as some of that perspective may be rooted in historical issues and historical matters, nonetheless, there will be a new dimension introduced, which I think ultimately will shape things up.
Based on your interactions with Malays of different walks of life, do you get a sense that Malays are ready to see the affirmative action policies, for us to do away with those policies?
Again, I can't speak for everyone, but my sense is there is an insecurity there, and it's understandable. And I think not enough is being done to address that insecurity by those who say that we should change the way things are. Because ultimately, whatever the case, right or wrong, we have a very large sector of our society and community having been taught to believe that they are not able to compete, that they need support from the government, otherwise they will be trampled over by the others in this country, or what is sacred to them or what is important to them will be ignored and desecrated. When you have that sort of rhetoric happening over a prolonged period of time, and as much as some of us may intellectually reject it, it does affect you. So I think ultimately we need to find ways to make sure that every one of us here, including the Malays, feel that we're not going to be left behind. And I think that calls for re-looking at the way in which we implement affirmative action. Because, I think generally no one has any issue with affirmative action for the Malays, as long as there is a poverty reduction efforts for non-Malays. No one has any issue with setting up special schools or whatever it is, as long as ultimately they're actually benefiting the target community. We're not seeing that. If after 50 plus years of independence we still say that the Malays are disadvantaged, and I will say that they are amongst the poorest in this country, some of them, then something's very wrong with the system, and we need to address that. But at the same time, we can't just jump into, we'll reject this because it's discriminatory, because whatever the case, you must address the insecurity, and you must make people feel that it's okay, this new thing that's being done won't marginalize me, won't leave me hanging in the balance, I won't become the victim of whatever it may be. And I think generally if there is enough political will to do that, it can be done. And I would think that anyone who's talking about reform must address that. There's no running away from it.
So if, say, you were elected as Member of Parliament, what would be some things you would do to address this insecurity?
Well, I think ultimately as I said earlier, looking at social inclusiveness policies is a very important thing. Looking at affirmative action issues is also extremely important because the Constitution does provide it. Unless the Constitution is amended for that to be removed, it's there. And whatever it is we want to say, the natives of Sabah Sarawak as well as the Malays have that special status. Now, having said that, you want to ensure that they are also, and when I say they, I don't like generalizing, I don't mean to be demeaning in any way, but ultimately the community should not be made to feel as if they are, their futures depend on the support. That they must be empowered, they must be given the wings to fly, as it were. And we should be looking at how to do that, which means that we have to look at the bigger picture. Is our education system functioning the way it should? Yes, a lot of graduates, but are they employable? If they're not, why? Are they coming up with the kind of confidence that they should be given by way of an education like that? These are the questions that we have to ask ourselves. Now, I can't promise I can do all of that, but this is one of the issues that I definitely think is an important thing to address. And if I may quickly just move on to one thing, it's one of the reasons why I've decided to support this MCLM initiative. And I'd like to make something clear here. MCLM is just an organization that's decided to support an idea that some of us had from much earlier on, called the Barisan Rakyat Independent Candidate Initiative. All right, a group of NGOs got together in 2007 to set up something called the Barisan Rakyat. There's a charter. It's called the People's Declaration, and we believe that charter, the People's Declaration, is available online. Sets out the aspirations and the fears of Malaysian society across the board. Now, at the moment, we feel, rather I feel, and so those who I've spoken to, people like Srikant Pillai, I think we share the same view on this, is that there's not enough discussion in the public discourse when politics is concerned on key themes of reform. And somewhere along the way, we're losing all the discussion on that to politics. So we see a lot of accusations and we see a lot of mudslinging, but unfortunately we're seeing very little traction on these sorts of issues. And I think there's a need for concerted focus on these key themes, which are civil liberties themes. And that is what led to some of us thinking that because of that vacuum, we may need to offer ourselves. Ultimately, we are pro-reform, and we support the pro-reform agenda, whatever form that takes. I've already said elsewhere that I'm not confident that the BN is capable of reforming in the way that it says it is. And for that reason, I felt that, okay, if there's a vacuum, and some of this vacuum may be caused by an inability on the part of Pakatan to recognize certain realities, then we need to step up. I'm doing this extremely reluctantly, as I know others are, because I'd rather get on with my life as it usually is. But, as I say, it's to address this vacuum that we see happening.
Well, let's say if the incumbent ruling party in the form of Barisan Nasional were to offer you an olive branch and offered to work with you on reforms that you are keen on, some of the people reforms that you talked about, would you consider working with the current administration if this was the most effective way to bring about reforms?
Well, there's never been, and that door has never been shut. And as a civil society activist as well as a lawyer, I've had consultations with people in government in the past, given them ideas. That's a process that's never not happened. It's happened. As to whether I'm prepared to stand politically with the Barisan, I don't think I am. Because the ideological underpinnings of our standing as independents lies in our not being part of any political party, because we don't want to be compromised or restricted in any way.
Okay, we'll need to talk more about your involvement in politics. We're speaking with Malik Imtiaz Sarwar, lawyer and political candidate for the Malaysian Civil Liberties Movement. We'll be back after this. On the Breakfast Grille this morning, Malik Imtiaz Sarwar is with us. He's a lawyer, political candidate for the Malaysian Civil Liberties Movement. If you have any questions for him, please send them to 016-201-9000. Now we have a question here from a listener. How do you plan to expand the appeal of MCLM?
Well, I think that's a good question. It's very relevant. The MCLM, as I said, is a separate organization, and one of the initiatives it's supporting is the Independent Candidates Initiative. So if the question is actually how we're going to make ourselves more appealing to voters, by late January, early February, we would have already defined the constituencies that those of us who support this initiative are going to be fielded in. And by early February, we will go to ground in those communities and work out ways in which we can reach out to people to explain what we think should be happening. Part of that will be town hall type meetings and other things along those lines. So that's how we're going to do it. As far as MCLM itself is concerned, as I said, I'm not a member, but from my discussions with them, they are doing a wider range of things, including training, potentially training election agents and counting agents and so on and so forth. And those services will be offered gratis to people who need that sort of help, as well as the other broader spectrum civil society work they're doing. I think they're participating in this rally next week about the Selangor situation. There's going to be a public rally there I'm told it's within a stadium, so with other civil society organizations like Bersih and so on. So I think ultimately when people have asked me this, I think I will let the work speak for itself. And I know there's been a bit of silence since the announcement, but that's because we're actually hunkering down and putting the material together, and we're going to be meeting the opposition, the non-BN parties very, very soon to discuss the possible collaborations. Because as has been explained in principle, we're not keen on three-cornering any fight. We'd rather not do that. And ultimately, the aim is not to sell ourselves, but to sell this idea that we need to have good candidates being offered to the people, and candidates whose priorities lie in servicing the people rather than a political agenda. Although I understand that you can't necessarily separate the two, as I've said earlier, but the emphasis must be on service. And to just take a cross-section, I think if you just ask around generally, your friends, there will be those who won't even know who their MPs are, although they voted them in. And that's interesting. And it may point to the fact that the MPs have not been doing enough to connect with people on the ground and so on. Now, I'm not saying that we'll be able to necessarily do better, but I believe that the focus on key themes, at least within certain types of constituencies, focus on key issues like education, medical issues, all these sorts of key civil political themes, that has its own appeal, and I think the work will speak for itself.
Okay, and well, it looks like you've been quite busy. I guess one question that people ask is, for example, you have the Prime Minister, who is obviously the President of UMNO, and they have come up with an economic transformation program. The government has come up with this ETP. And on the opposition side, they've come up with this 100-day reform plan if they were to take over Putrajaya. What about for the independent candidates? Are you going to come together and say we're going to come up with some sort of shadow cabinet or a shadow master plan?
Well, that's one of the things we're discussing. Although the candidates are really independent and they're not bound to go one way or the other, they are being selected on the basis that they have certain qualities, and they are generally people who are perceived as being trustworthy and so on. The idea is to actually collaborate between all of us and to work out a way in which we can help improve the discourse, can add to the discourse, and part of that will be obviously shadowing policies and issues. Already in many ways civil society does that, and I'd like to stress that this is actually a civil society response. So when you said earlier about my entering politics, yeah, sure, in the loosest sense, yes, but I'm not a party member. I'm not a member of any political party. If ultimately I feel that my standing is counterproductive to the reform agenda, I will not stand. And I think Srikanth shares the same view, and the other candidates as well.
Well, just picking on one or two things now. For example, in this 100-day reform plan that was come up by Pakatan Rakyat, one of the things they wanted to do was to raise salaries of teachers by 500 ringgit, abolishing toll. I mean, just picking your brains on this, what's your stand on, say, toll?
Well, I think ultimately concessions should not be used to give windfall gains to concessionaires. I think, yes, they have to be paid for the work they're doing. They have to be given some form of compensation to make it a little bit worthwhile for them. But concessions are, in a general sense, a form of public service. So, and you have constituencies where the only way into that constituency is really, effective means is through a toll highway. That means you're paying toll to get into where you live and to get out of it. I don't think that's right. And I think if we're going to give concessions, we should cap the number of years that people can benefit from this. And there doesn't seem to be any limit on that sort of thing now. Same goes for the water concessions and so on. And the water concessions is interesting because the fact that the government felt the need to step in and federalize control over water and set up the commission, I think that's an indication that privatization has not worked in the way that they thought it might. And then when you think about the leakage issues, and no pun on that word, but the issues of corruption, as much as we try and put that skeleton back into the closet, it's there. Corruption is a huge issue that we have to deal with ultimately. So I think, if the idea is a good one, and it's good for the people, and it benefits everyone, I don't see why it shouldn't be supported. And that's what we're trying to say, that sometimes there are good ideas on the part of the BN, and there are good ideas on the part of the Pakatan as well. And where the ideas are good, then shouldn't there be a duty on the part of the MPs to actually support the good ideas rather than take political positions on them because they belong to a particular political faction?
Well, we have a question from a listener here. Have you started your fundraising campaign?
Informally, yes. There have been, I'm quite surprised actually, because quite a few people have stepped forward to say that they're happy to donate and to help raise funds. And informally, I think, that's not going to be a big issue for at least me. So I think that's where I'll be.
And another question from a listener: how can I join MCLM and work with you?
Well, the MCLM website is up. I think there's information there. You can become a member of MCLM and you can indicate that you'd like to be part of a particular initiative, and that could be our initiative. And you could then indicate that you want to join a particular candidate's team, and we'd be happy to consider the possibilities. Because ultimately, I think what we're trying to show is that everyone, okay, let me put it this way, everyone has said you're doomed to failure, independents never win. And that might be true. But there are a couple of things that we should be thinking about. One is it time for maybe a new way of looking at things? Are our younger voters, are they happy with the way things are happening right now? Shouldn't as much importance be given to the process as the result? Winning is important, yes, but the way in which you get to that end is equally important because it's a process of empowerment. So I figure it this way, the campaign phase, as it were, is in two stages. The first stage is we go out there, we tell people what we're about, we tell people why we think these issues need to be thought about, make it about the issues rather than ourselves. Let that speak for itself. And if that works, then, well, people really walk away with a greater understanding of how things are and what they should be thinking about. And that in itself is a victory. But if we move forward and then we stand for election, and obviously we're not going to do that in an uninformed way, we're going to take polls and we're going to think about how productive it will be, whether it's going to be, if it's, for example, if a constituency is selected and it's not something that particularly likes a person like me, it would be silly for me to say that I insist, because I don't want to ultimately, as I said, undermine the process itself. As I've said earlier, the main thing here is a pro-reform agenda. We support it. I think themes have to be emphasized. There's not enough discussion of that as a vacuum. What we're going to do is to address that in the public sphere, talk about it, emphasize why we think it's important, emphasize that even if there's a change of government or if this government stays on, if we're going to talk about reform, we have to talk about it meaningfully, and reform means A, B, C, and D. And I think that in itself is already valuable effort.
Well, speaking about, I know your intentions are noble, but what is Pakatan Rakyat's perception of MCLM? And this is a question from a listener.
Sure. There's been no formal indication from the Pakatan, but informally, it's not been unreceptive. They're not necessarily opposed to what we're doing. Some have gone so far as to suggest that it's a useful complement to what it is that they're trying to do. And I would remind listeners that there was a point in the last election when there were individuals who stood as independents but under the banner of a particular political party.
Well, another question from a listener: can MCLM or independent candidates rather have a durable cohesiveness in the long run without any more united political ideology?
Well, I'd like to ask in return, what cohesiveness is there in the political parties? I don't think one necessarily guarantees a result more than the other. I think it comes back to the ability. I think I'm being glib there. That's not fair to the listener. I think let me restate that. Of course, being part of a party, having an ideology would restrict in a way. But where those restrictions tend to focus on the politics, then the issues, I'm not sure that's necessarily a good cohesiveness. I don't know. So yes, I think what we're doing is a little bit radical, but there is a point to it. The candidates who are going to be fielded will work together, even though they're independents. That much we're sure of, because we know each other and we're capable of working with each other. We share a common view on the fundamentals, and we believe that our conscience and principle will take us down a particular line.
And you not wanting to join Pakatan Rakyat, and preferring to stand as an independent? Is it because that you may support some of their bigger policies or bigger reform agenda, but you may not necessarily support certain leaders in the coalition?
Well, it's not so much about individuals as it is about the politics of the coalition as well. I don't think right now, if you think about it, you have to, well, there are two levels to this, I think if I wanted to join a political party, then I think one of the parties in the Pakatan would be my choice.
Which would it be?
DAP. All right, because I've known people in the DAP for a long time, and I'm from Penang. DAP is quite strong there, and so on. And I think it's, as much as people say it's a chauvinist party, I don't necessarily buy into that. I think it's quite fair in the way it approaches things. Internal politics are different things altogether, right? Because that will be that. But generally, in what it's doing, I like very much what Lim Guan Eng is doing in Penang. And the cooperation is close. We've worked with them all this while. I do work for the Penang State Government. I do advise the DAP from time to time. I do work for the Selangor Government, and I don't think there's any difficulty there. But the problem I have is actually a principle of an ideological issue. Because if I step in to a political party, then in as much as you say you're not going to be constrained by the politics of it, you will, ultimately. And we've seen certain fallout happening within Catalan already. And that's something that I think we're concerned about. Also, if you're part of the party structure, then you're bound by the coalition line. And what if the things we want to emphasize are things that the coalition doesn't necessarily want to speak about? For example, putting it plainly, that the Islamic State agenda. Every time we hear of Hadi saying something, you have Karpal saying no. And you don't have a clear response from Anwar on one thing or the other, or Aziza for that matter. I'm sorry for not using their titles, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but there it is, So what if I wanted to say that I think it's ridiculous to even consider this as an Islamic state? I think it's an Islamic country. And that's something that I'm not supposed to be saying because it might offend the coalition partners and so on. And you have the same problem on the other side as well. Does that mean we just let the issue just not be addressed? I mean, there's a sentiment on the part of some that, oh well, you should just support the pro-reform agenda fully, let it change, and then do what you have to do. But then if we institute change on a precarious foundation, what sort of change are we inviting? So I think this MCLM initiative, the Barisan Rakyat venture, as I said, should be looked at in two stages. It's not aimed at undermining anything, but it's aimed at enriching the experience. And if the two can come to a harmonious blend, wonderful. If it can't, then we are all at liberty to at any point in time say we think this is not good for the nation. And those of us who are stepping forward, I think, have always put that interest first. And as I said, this is not about my personal ambitions or anything. I'd rather not be doing this. But I think I've been told by people that you should, not because and these are views that I value. They feel that I can contribute to public service. And I have been contributing to public service in the past, and this is just the next logical step forward. But it's not cast in stone.
Well, talking about personal ambition, you joined MCLM and gained some political traction, say, but you start getting death threats, and it's something that's, it's something that you've experienced, getting threats now, and let's say your loved ones get harassed, and maybe your legal firm will suffer. What will you do?
Well, I think when you take a decision to do something, you take it, and you've thought it through as much as you possibly can, and made decisions based on that. But I'd like to think that we're at a stage of our lives in this country where decisions like this are not going to be met with that sort of hostility. I mean, I think it's sad that, and I can see the reality of it. I think it's sad that when it was announced that I was being offered as a candidate by the MCLM, I got a lot of phone calls from people saying, "Are you sure? You're exposing yourself to risk?" And I'm thinking, what sort of risk is that? Mudslinging, sure, that's going to happen because it's politics. But what sort of risk should I be worried about? And then people say things like ISA detentions and all the things that have haunted us in the past. And I'm saying, well, is that why we're not moving forward? Because every time somebody steps up and says, I'd like to contribute to society, they're going to be whacked down because of intimidation and fear. Now, I'm not inviting an ISA detention, obviously not.
But I'm sure you'll be able to secure your own release.
I don't know about that, but I'm just saying that I think we have to give some credit to the leaders on the other side to make the right kinds of decisions. Of course, they never consistently done that, and they've done some pretty bizarre things in the past, like detaining that journalist and then saying it was for her own safety and stuff like that. I'm aware of what they're doing, but ultimately I'd like to think that we're not in this situation where, an all-out operasi lalang or whatever it is going to happen just because. Having said that, I know I sound completely naive and idealistic, and I shouldn't because I've been involved in a lot of that myself, but I think credit has to be given somewhere. You know, that ultimately I think there is a genuine, at least in some quarters, there's a genuine appreciation that we need some form of change for the better. How it's going to get there and what's going to happen to get there, that's still up in the air, I think. And in as much as we say Pakatan is the answer, I don't know about that, because there are some weaknesses that have to be addressed. And, you know, we've always talked about the BN being weak and so on, and, you know, we've accepted that there are some strengths there. You know, they've got us as far as they have this far. And that's something that has to be given credit for, and it's not easy. Although I will say that I think we could have been a lot further down that road if we had approached things a bit differently. But, you know, we have to give credit there as well. Doesn't mean that just because one works, the other has no value. And doesn't mean because this one is the way it is, it cannot be improved. And what we're talking about is a civil society response to seeing whether we can help improve the situation independently. And that's what we're trying to do.
Well, on this note, I wish you all the best in your political campaign. Thank you for spending time with us this morning. Malik Imtiaz Sarwar, lawyer, activist and political candidate for the Malaysian Civil Liberties Movement. I'm Noel Lim on BFM 89.9.